Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. They say the mountains keep their secrets, that the fog that clings to Appalachia at dawn is not just mist, but memory. Memory of families who lived and died in silence, bound to one another in ways too unnatural to speak aloud. And among those shadowed ridges, whispers remain of a father and son, who shared the same bed, not out of poverty, not out of necessity, but as a continuation of a bloodline that had already twisted itself into something unrecognizable. This was not love, nor was it accident, it was inheritance, passed down like the land, like the cabin, like the name itself, a cycle of flesh that folded in on itself until the distinction between father and son blurred into nothing, and when the neighbors asked, they did not receive answers, only silence. Because here, in these forgotten hollows, silence was safer than truth. You see, inbreeding in the Appalachians was not always born of isolation alone. Yes, geography played its part. Mountains can trap families like cages, but deeper still was tradition, unwritten and unspoken. Family was blood, and blood was everything. And once the walls of the mountains closed around you, the world outside ceased to exist. The only partners, the only companions, the only heirs were those already within your home. Imagine the child born into such a place, his father, his uncle, his brother, sometimes all with the same man, a son who could not tell whether the man who raised him was his parent or his rival or something far more disturbing. And when he came of age, the bed that once held him as a child became something else entirely, a site of inheritance, a site of shame, a site of horror. Historians call it the collapse of bloodlines. Psychologists call it generational trauma. But in those cabins, they had no name for it. It was simply life, and when you step back and look at what became of those children, the twisted faces, the hollowed eyes, the fragile bodies born of too much closeness, you realize that silence was not protection. It was the weapon that ensured the cycle would never break. In the story I am about to tell you, we will peel back those layers, not just the history of inbreeding in Appalachia, but the single lineage so infamous, so corrupted it. The house stood crooked against the hillside, its wood blackened by rain, its roof sagging under decades of neglect. To the outsider, it was just another Appalachian shack, one of countless relics of poverty dotting the mountainside. But to those who lived nearby, it carried a reputation whispered with unease. They knew what had happened inside. They knew what still lingered in the blood of those who walked out its door. The lineage began simply enough, as most do, a man and a woman raising children in the harsh grip of rural America. But somewhere along the way, the walls of that family closed in too tightly. Brothers took sisters, fathers claimed daughters, mothers birthed children whose faces bore the unmistakable marks of too much repetition. And yet, the cycle didn't stop. Each new generation grew less distinguishable from the last, until the family tree no longer branched, it folded. But what makes this story stand apart from countless other tales of Appalachian inbreeding is one detail so disturbing that even neighboring families could not speak of it aloud. For in this house, the father did not simply pass his blood to his daughter, as was common in these whispered tragedies. He passed it to his son, a bed, a bond, and a secret so vile it blackened the family name for decades. The boy who became a man under that roof never escaped. He didn't just inherit the land or the poverty, he inherited his father's role. The bed that once was his place of childhood sleep became his prison, and when his father was gone, he repeated what had been done to him. Sons became fathers, fathers became sons, until no one could remember where the cycle began. There are no photographs of them in the early years, only the stories, passed through neighbors who caught glimpses of the children when they wandered too close to town. Sunken cheeks, eyes set too far apart, mouths twisted, words slurred, bodies frail and trembling as though even standing was too much for their frame. people looked away quickly, ashamed not for themselves, but for the reminder of what was possible when bloodlines collapsed into themselves. And the cabin still stood for years, a rotting monument to silence. Its windows shuttered, its doors creaking in the wind, holding within it the smell of sweat, rot, and secrets never confessed. It was not poverty alone that cursed that house. It was the family inside it, a family bound not by choice, but by the prison of blood. The mountains have always been storytellers. They echo with the voices of those who walked them before, carrying rumors like wind through the hollows, and the rumor of this family spread far beyond their hillside. It was said that if you ventured close enough, you could hear the sound of crying at night, not the cry of a baby, not the wail of grief, but something caught between the two, something that didn't sound fully human. Neighbors rarely approached, but when they did, they noticed things. A boy with a face that seemed unfinished, his jaw too small for his teeth, his eyes rolling in opposite directions. Another child, unable to form words, communicating only with moans and gestures. They did not play in the fields like other children. They lingered close to the house, clinging to one another like shadows afraid of light. What made it worse was not just their appearance, but the way the family moved. They walked together in silence, as if afraid that speech itself might reveal too much. And yet, when one of the children looked at his father, there was something in the gaze, too knowing, too intimate, that unsettled those who saw it. It was not the look of a child toward his parent. It was something darker, something that betrayed the bed they shared. By the 20th century, science had a name for what was happening here. The consequences of incest, genetic mutations, cognitive decline, bodies too frail to survive. But in those mountains, people did not speak of science. They spoke of curses. They said the land itself had trapped the family, punishing them for sins long forgotten. But the truth was simpler and far more disturbing. There was no curse. There was only choice, made by one man, then passed down like a legacy. It is easy to judge from a distance, to dismiss these people as monsters. But what if you had been born into that cabin, with no world beyond those mountains, no guidance but the example of the man who raised you? Would you have broken free, or would you have surrendered, as every son in that house eventually did? That is the horror of this story. It was not just survival, it was obedience. An obedience so absolute, it carried from one generation to the next, like scripture. And in the silence of those hills, the family endured, deformed, shunned, but enduring. A living testament to what happens when secrecy becomes law, and the bed of a father becomes the inheritance of his son. There is a cruelty in memory, a way it clings to places long after the people have gone. That cabin, sagging deeper into the hillside with each passing year, seemed almost alive with what it had witnessed. Visitors who stumbled too close spoke of an air that felt heavy, a stillness so unnatural it pressed against the chest like a hand. Even in daylight, the house looked like night had settled over it, a permanent dusk that refused to lift. Inside, the bed was said to be the centerpiece, a single frame passed down like an heirloom, its wood warped and splintered with age. To most, a bed is a place of rest. To them, it was the altar of their lineage. Fathers brought sons into it when they were still boys. Sons grew into men, and when the time came, they claimed their own sons in the same sheets. It was not just an act. It was a ritual, a pattern so deeply ingrained that breaking it would have been unthinkable. And when outsiders questioned, when whispers began to circulate, the family's defense was always the same: silence. They rarely appeared in town. They traded only when necessary, often sending the children no one dared to look at for long. The shame was visible on their faces, etched in bone structure and lopsided smiles. But shame in that house was not enough to stop the cycle. If anything, it seemed to fuel it. The outside world could stare, could whisper, could recoil, but the family carried on, bound by loyalty to blood above all else. What is most chilling is how ordinary the rest of their lives appeared. They planted gardens, they mended clothes, they cooked meals from what little they could hunt or grow. By day, they seemed like any other poor family scraping survival out of the dirt. But at night, when the fire died low and the house fell into shadow, the true inheritance revealed itself, and each child learned in time that their destiny was already written. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Most turn away from stories like this, dismissing them as exaggeration or legend or something too grotesque to be true. But the mountains do not lie. They keep what they're given. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have fought to escape, or would the silence have swallowed you too? By the middle of the 20th century, America was changing. Highways were being cut through mountains, electricity reached towns once lost in the dark, and the old isolation of Appalachia began to crack. But for families like this one, the light of modernity never seemed to reach their door. Outsiders came with cameras, with questions, with curiosity disguised as pity. And when they saw the children, grown now into men and women, they were confronted with faces that seemed more like echoes of a forgotten age than products of the modern world. One son in particular became the subject of hushed fascination. His features were warped, his speech reduced to grunts and strange vocalizations. Locals described him as both childlike and frightening, moving in sudden, erratic ways. He was known to wander barefoot through the woods, sometimes for hours, always returning to the cabin before nightfall. To those who saw him, he was a symbol of what unchecked lineage could become, a body and mind unraveling under the weight of too many generations folded into themselves. Journalists and researchers who dared to approach often found themselves driven away by the sheer discomfort of what they encountered. They wanted to document poverty, to photograph hardship, to write of forgotten America, but what they found here went beyond poverty. It was something ancient, something primal, something that unsettled even those hardened by years of reporting. One wrote in his notes, never published, "This family should not exist, not in this time, not in this place. They are the living proof of what silence can create." And through it all, the bed remained. It was whispered that even when sons grew into twisted reflections of their fathers, they were still pulled into that same ritual. No matter how grotesque the result, the lineage demanded continuation, not because of desire, not even because of tradition, but because the family knew nothing else. To break the cycle would be to admit that the past had been wrong, and that was a truth they could not bear to face. When the highway came closer, when the town spread its borders, the family only withdrew further into themselves. The world outside expanded, but inside those walls, time stood still. And as decades passed, the family became less a part of Appalachia and more a legend of it. A warning whispered to children about what happens when a family turns inward too far and refuses to ever look beyond its own blood. The tragedy of this lineage is not just written in their faces, but in the way history itself tried to bury them. Families nearby would not speak their name. Schools did not record their children. Churches refused to acknowledge their existence. To the community, they were a shadow best ignored, a reminder of a darkness no one wanted to confront. And so the family endured in silence, unbroken by intervention, unseen by compassion. But silence is never empty. It leaves scars that echo through generations. For those children born of fathers and sons, there was no sense of self beyond the blood that bound them. Imagine growing up with no concept of family outside of your own house, taught that love and duty and flesh were all the same. No chance to choose, no chance to resist, no chance to know anything else. Every look in the mirror carried the reminder of what you were made from. Every glance at your father told you who you would become. The physical marks of inbreeding are horrific enough: collapsed jaws, twisted spines, voices that never form words. But the deeper horror is invisible. The mind trapped within boundaries set long before birth. Sons who did not know how to dream of a life beyond their father's bed. Daughters who bore children whose fathers were also their brothers. Each generation born into a script already written, unable to deviate, unable to break free. And yet, they survived. That is perhaps the most haunting part. Year after year, decade after decade, the family persisted in the same shack, eating from the same soil, repeating the same cycle. Poverty could not erase them, shame could not silence them, even the weight of deformity could not stop them. Like weeds in the cracks of stone, they grew, they multiplied, they endured. Some would argue this is resilience, others call it damnation, but whatever name you choose, the fact remains. This family's. I became a living chronicle of what happens when bloodlines collapse inward, when the roles of father and son blur until they are indistinguishable. And though their story is shrouded in myth, though records are scarce and details hidden, the truth is undeniable. They were real, they walked those mountains, they bore those children. And the bed that chained them together still lingers in memory, a symbol of silence more powerful than any curse. Even now, long after the cabin has rotted into the earth and the family has thinned into whispers, the story refuses to die. Appalachia carries it like a scar. Travelers who ask too many questions are told quietly to leave it alone. Locals avert their eyes, insisting there are some things better left unspoken, yet the legend surfaces again and again, on the lips of historians, in the journals of anthropologists, in the trembling voices of those who once lived nearby. The horror is not confined to one family, not even to Appalachia. It is a mirror. It shows us what happens when shame is allowed to grow unchecked, when secrecy becomes stronger than compassion, when loyalty to blood outweighs loyalty to life itself. That bed, the one shared by father and son, was not just wood and cloth. It was an altar of silence. Every creak of its frame was a confession, every shadow cast across its sheets a testimony to the weight of what had been done. Some say the children who survived carried the trauma into other valleys, that their descendants walk among us still, faces softened by time, but bloodlines still bearing the echo of those twisted unions. Others believe the line ended, swallowed whole by deformity and despair, leaving only the story behind. The truth, like the fog that rolls through the mountains, is impossible to hold. It slips through the fingers, leaving behind only dampness, only chill. But one thing is certain. This was not an accident of geography, nor merely the product of poverty. It was a choice made once and then repeated, defended, protected by silence. And that silence is the true villain of the story. Because silence gave permission, silence handed down the ritual from father to son like a family heirloom. Silence built the prison that no one dared escape. So if you ever find yourself walking the ridges of Appalachia at night and the fog settles low, remember this story. Remember the house that stood in the hollow, the children who bore the burden of blood too close, the bed that was both inheritance and tomb, and remember that history is not always written in books or etched in stone. Sometimes it survives only as a whisper carried by mountains, warning us what happens when families become their own graves.